Administration at the Brookings Institution, a think tank located in Washington, D.C. So I'd like to welcome you to our forum on the impact of mobile technology on economic growth and job creation around the world. How many of you heard Paul Jacobs' keynote presentation last night? Raise your hand if you were there for that. Okay, some of you heard it. Those of you who did not hear it, he showed the amazing era in which we live from the standpoint of mobile technology. He talked about how mobile is transforming the entertainment business, education, healthcare, business, government, and many other walks of life. And it was really impressive to see the many new applications that are coming online. I was at the World Mobile Congress in Barcelona last spring, and there researchers said that by 2016, 80% of the broadband subscriptions around the world will be through mobile devices, either smartphones or tablets. It's going to alter how we get information and the manner in which we conduct business. By that time period, we expect that there will be 10 billion mobile devices in use around the world. Due to the importance of the mobile revolution, at Brookings, we have launched a mobile economy project, and we're looking at the impact of mobile on healthcare, education, government, and entrepreneurship around the world. Invention is accelerating at a very rapid rate, and we need to understand how it is affecting business and consumers and what the policies are that would help encourage and facilitate innovation. You can, we have put out a variety of papers. We've conducted a number of forums on the topic, so you can go to our website at brookings.edu to get the papers and see the archive videos on our web events. Our panel today is going to look at the economic benefits of mobile broadband in terms of worker productivity, economic growth, and job creation. With access to apps, information, and resources, smartphones and tablets are affecting virtually every industry and every sector by making communication faster and easier than ever. We're going to focus on the topics of both the opportunities for and the barriers to economic growth through mobile devices. In particular, we'll look at the impact of mobile technology and how it affects future economic growth. To help us understand the benefits and barriers to mobile technology, we have brought together an outstanding set of speakers. Michael Beckerman is president and CEO of the Internet Association. There he works with America's leading internet companies and seeks to advance public policy solutions that foster innovation, promote economic growth, and strengthen internet freedom. Prior to that, he served as deputy staff director of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and Policy Director for Congressman Fred Upton. Coleman Bazelon is the principal of the Brattle Group. He is an expert on regulation and strategy in the wireless, wireline, and video sectors. He has consulted and testified on behalf of numerous clients in the telecommunications industry, ranging from wireless license auctions, spectrum management, and competition policy. Karen Evans is a partner at KE&T Partners. She is the ex-administrator for e-government and IT at the Office of Management and Budget. She's often referred to as the Fed's unofficial CIO, or the e-government czar, when she was in government. She worked for the federal government for more than 25 years, and among her achievements were working on enterprise architecture for government IT and setting standards that transform the vast networks on which government relies. Ari Fitzgerald is a partner in the Hogan and Lovells law firm and serves as an advisor to Mobile Future. His practice focuses on wireless, satellite, international communications, and internet-related issues. He served as a counsel to several communications-related trade associations in the United States and Europe and represents many of those carriers, equipment suppliers, and investors in spectrum-related and regulatory policy proceedings. So I want to start with Michael. I mean, you focus on the intersection of mobile and internet. How is internet usage moving to mobile, and what will be the broader impact on the economy and in our daily lives?
Thank you. Well, I'll start maybe by polling the audience with a question. I'd be interested to know how many of you on your smartphones or your mobile devices are using it more for phone calls or using it more for internet-based services. And so maybe first, who's using your phone primarily to actually make a phone call? Raise your hand. 2 people. And how many are using your phone primarily for internet-based. That's everybody else. All right, so that I think proves the point that the internet really is driving mobile. People, you go downstairs and you look at all the new mobile devices, and part of the reason everybody's buying a new device, they're developing these new devices, because there's so many great, innovative, and life-changing products and services from the internet companies, and you want to buy the new device. And therefore, also, companies are investing in these new high-speed networks, not because people are making more phone calls, but because there's more data usage, and that's creating jobs and economic growth. Really the impact of mobile from the internet, there's a real multiplier effect, because when you're just making a phone call, you're just, it's person to person, versus if you're using your phone for an internet service, you're finding new businesses, you're streaming movies or music, you're getting advertising, and so the impact on the economy is much greater now that we're using our mobile devices for products on the internet. And when you think back on how you're using mobile a year ago, 5 years ago, or even from your first mobile phone, it's changed a lot from today. And it's going to continue to change in the future. And that's creating jobs in many sectors of the economy. And I think that's important for policymakers to take note of, because the products are changing on the internet, and regulations that they might have today could stifle future innovation, which will create jobs and economic growth in this sector.
Okay, Kieran, you focus on the public sector, and I know the Federal CIO Council recently released a report regarding the opportunities in the public sector. So I'm just curious, what are the best opportunities that you see for the public sector to innovate in terms of service delivery?
There is a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of opportunities for innovation going forward using mobile technology. And I'd like to talk about a few of those, because the federal government, as well as state and local government, so the whole public sector, is really focusing on how can you give the best customer interaction, how can you provide these government services in the best way that you can. And just by this audience's question and answer, most people are interacting now with mobile devices, which means that you want to get your fishing license, you want to renew your driver's license, you want to pay your parking ticket, or you want to reserve something at a national park through a mobile device. Or when you're there, you want to get that type of information available of what kind of government services are available, where you are geo-positioned at that point. There's a lot of data that the government has, and so there are several initiatives that are underway. There's big data, there's digital government, there's an executive order that's out by the Obama administration about improving customer service, and all of that is through mobile devices, is how they're looking at that. And then the newest policy out there is bring your own device to work. And by that really scares the public sector. But I view that this is the opportunity in the public sector as well, because if we could really harness the innovation, and I know there's a lot of creativity out there, that the mobile device could actually be that authentication device that they have to have as well for your identity. So you can have multiple identities based on who you are through the mobile device. But the challenges that the CIO Council has outlined is, okay, how do I manage that if they have multiple personalities, so to speak, on it, my private versus my public sector life on the same device? How do I wipe it clean if it's lost? How am I going to manage it? How am I going to manage the identities? And then there are the whole other issues of record management, security, and privacy associated with people who interact with the public sector if they're going to be doing that through mobile devices. So the opportunities are huge. And then the last piece, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, is that the budget situation, the fiscal cliff, when you hear about that, the sequestration, and we could go into a lot of that, that is going to force the federal agencies really to take on these new and opportunities to reduce their operating costs. So when we are talking about economic growth and worker productivity, this is the area that, because they are not going to be able to spend the money, that they are going to be able to be more, they will be more creative, and this is the way that they're going to go, is through mobile technology.
Okay, Coleman, we know that one factor that is limiting economic development has been spectrum availability. So what should we do to free up additional spectrum for wireless applications? And if we do that, what will be the economic benefits?
Sure, thanks, Daryl. So before answering that directly, I want to talk a little bit about capacity on wireless networks and where it comes from, just to remind us what drives all of this. To use a mobile device, you need to mix spectrum and capital investments. And there is always a trade-off through adding more cell sites or more equipment to your network. There's always a trade-off between adding capacity by adding spectrum to a network or by adding more capital investments. And to give a little perspective on how important these different aspects of capacity are, looking back over the last 8 years in the US, and I'm just using the US as an example because the data was more easily available. There's something, if you go back to 2005 to 2012, there's something like 40 times the amount of demands put on the wireless networks in the US. These are very rounded numbers that make the math easy. During that time, there have been a little less than a doubling of the number of cell sites and a little less than doubling of the amount of capital put into the wireless networks. So maybe 2x of that increase is from capital investments. There's been about a doubling of the amount of radio spectrum that's been put into deployed over that time. And that leaves about 10x of the capacity improvements that are related to technological improvements and going from 2G to 3G and on to 4G networks. Going forward, we are going to be using more efficient technologies as we move on to LTE. Carriers are inevitably going to continue to invest in new equipment and cell division and new technologies to increase the capacity of their networks. But without more spectrum, that's going to be an increasingly expensive activity. In the trade-off between capital and spectrum, the amount of capital you need to invest to double the capacity of a given amount of spectrum increases each time you double it. So if you go from 1 cell site to 2, that's a doubling of the cell sites and a doubling of the capacity. But the next time you have to add 2 additional cell sites, that's 4 total, to double the capacity again. And that is an increasing cost curve. So the future is going to be one where either we take a path of abundant spectrum for mobile broadband that's also going to mean that the dollars invested in deployments will go much further and create much more capacity, or we'll have a future where there's less spectrum. Wireless is not going to fall off a cliff and disappear as a service, but it will be a more expensive service with tighter data caps and more expensive data plans. And the importance of this for the development is that all the wireless applications and the spreading of broadband, the lower the cost, the lower the infrastructure cost for this platform of wireless data connectivity, and it is all about data now. The lower those costs, the more types of applications we'll see, the more uses we'll see, the deeper into the economy we'll see these devices and networks. And so we're going to be losing out a lot if we don't take the path of more spectrum and lower costs. We know that that there's a lot of jobs and a lot of economic development at stake. I think Secretary Summers said a couple of years ago that for every dollar invested in broadband infrastructure, the economy gets $7 to $10 back out. That number is probably greater outside the US, where there's more benefits, more bang for the buck in the investments. So getting more spectrum so that the technology, so that the capital that's invested is invested more efficiently and more productively is going to be key.
Okay, Ari, you focus on government regulatory policy. So what are the regulatory and/or policy frameworks that we need in order to promote the growth of mobile as a driver of economic growth?
Yeah, and thanks, Daryl. Coleman and I are going to play tag team a little bit on this because really, I do believe I have to give kudos to this administration and administrations going all the way back to President Clinton's administration as to how they handled what the regulatory frameworks they established to promote wireless. there has been a bipartisan consensus for a very long time that wireless should be regulated with a light touch. It has been regulated with a light touch. There's been more competition in the wireless sector than there has with the mobile sector than there has been with wired. And the result that we've achieved is something that the U.S. should be very proud about. We have a competitive sector. Half of U.S. consumers own smartphones. 3/4 of all tablets in use in the world are being used in the United States. The mobile app economy alone accounts for 520,000 jobs in this country. 4 million people have jobs that are wireless related. $150 billion in GDP is contributed every year in the U.S. By the wireless industry. So it's a lot to be proud of. But Coleman said it very well. Spectrum is key. If we're going to continue this growth path, we need more spectrum. And there are a lot of challenges associated with getting that spectrum, especially the beachfront property that is needed to promote, support mobile broadband. What we're talking about is spectrum between 225 megahertz and 3.7 gigahertz. This is the most valuable spectrum. Unlike many countries of the world, our government controls a lot of the spectrum, and a good amount of it is also held by broadcasters. So how's the U.S. doing? Well, several years ago in the National Broadband Plan, I see Commissioner Clyburn here, her colleague, and Commissioner Clyburn stated that a plan needed to be launched to increase the amount of spectrum that is made available for mobile broadband, and they proposed 500 megahertz of new spectrum being made available for mobile broadband. And they've made significant progress toward that goal. They also proposed incentive auctions, and Congress enacted legislation last year, and the FCC has started to implement a very complicated process for hopefully encouraging broadcasters to voluntarily relinquish some of their spectrum so that it can be used for wireless broadband. Just 3 weeks ago, the Commission loosened up 20 megahertz of spectrum that was unused completely in the 2 gigahertz band. It was spectrum that had been set aside for mobile satellite service that was never used. Now Dish can use it to provide terrestrial services. They've opened up proceedings relating to other spectrum. In the legislation that was passed last year, Congress mandated that the Commission auction off some additional spectrum. But frankly, given the capacity needs, we need to set in motion some type of process, a regular process that will ensure that this insatiable appetite that we have for spectrum is satisfied. And we're not going to do that unless we do a better job of making sure that the government uses spectrum more efficiently. Right now, we are focusing a lot on trying to figure out how to relocate government users off of spectrum so that it can be used for mobile broadband. And the one focus right now is on the 1755 to 1780 megahertz band. Frankly, in a way, that's a good exercise, but we need to be thinking about focusing on the issue at the front end. When the federal government says, agencies in the federal government say, we need additional spectrum, NTIA, which is the regulator of federal government spectrum use, should be asking the question, can the commercial providers satisfy this need? Do you really need to have this spectrum license? Do you need to be the ones authorized to use the spectrum? I think if we start asking those questions on the front end, we might be able to avoid the disruption and the problems that we have in sort of, relocating government users. I'm going to stop there, and I think later on we can sort of talk about a little bit more, get into more granular detail about some of these issues.
And of course, you reserve the right to extend your remarks on any occasion.
I reserve the right to extend.
I'm going to throw out a couple questions for the entire panel, and any of you who want to jump in are free to do so. And after that, we'll open the floor to any questions and comments from our audience. So the questions are, what do you see as the primary obstacles in the mobile area that are constraining economic growth? how can we overcome those obstacles, and are there specific examples of success stories where we're getting it right? Anyone who wants to jump in? Don't be shy.
Well, I can do it from a specific user perspective. So primary constraints, I really think that in the public sector, or as I'm watching this through the nonprofit sector as well, is the fear of the unknown. And that is, they don't, the management of moving to mobile devices and where exactly how I'm going to manage the data that is produced by the different programs or services within the federal government, they are nervous about that, and they're also nervous about the security and the accountability associated with it. So as you move out and then it becomes more mobile, they are used to the traditional way of how you secure devices and how you secure servers and how you secure data, and if I own it and I can see it and I have those devices. So the idea of being mobile and moving in and using cloud services together with mobile devices, that really is a technical architecture type of issue, but because they don't really fully understand all the different ways of how you could either secure it or make sure that the data stays the way that the data needs to stay, they're a little slower to adapt it. And so that ends up being a primary obstacle when you have pressure from your consumer on the other side, where the citizen really wants to interact with the government through mobile devices. And so that pressure, that yin and yang, makes it look like the government's not very innovative in its service delivery.
Okay, other comments? Obstacles and how we overcome them.
So, I would point to every successful spectrum reallocation is a great success. And one thing to point out about them is when they have been very long processes. The digital television transition started in the 1980s and only concluded in 2009. The AWS spectrum was talked about for a decade before it was finally auctioned and reallocated. In that auction, T-Mobile needed spectrum badly and went in and at that time in the development of the wireless industry and that company, there was spectrum available that was crucial for them to be successful, and they're a national player that is one of the top 4 players in the marketplace today. That was not the outcome that was forecasted 10 years earlier when we set down the road. We knew that there'd be a demand for it, but we don't know exactly how it was going to come about. And I think I take that as a lesson for this, that we don't know exactly what the mobile apps are going to be or what the demands on the system are going to be, but we do know that they will be there and there will be a company that's going to need that spectrum when it comes. All spectrum all the time.
One obstacle that could come down the line on the policy side, one of the great things about mobile is it allows for location-based applications. What restaurant is near me, or using a map function to get from point A to point B. Social media, dealing with your friends, like, oh, here's where I am. And as that, it's a very new, I think, aspect to mobile and new aspect that policymakers are going to look at, and I think it's creating jobs and economic benefit, and certainly for consumers. And so it's very important that policymakers take a very light regulatory touch and be very careful what they pursue regulating location-based, because it's providing new services for consumers.
Hey, Daryl, one thing that, again, going back to what the Commission did, the FCC did a couple of years ago, one really great benefit of the National Broadband Plan that they put out was they talked about, not only did they talk about the need for spectrum and the need to promote fixed broadband, but they talked about how broadband could help other industry sectors. They talked about the benefits of ubiquitous broadband for education, for healthcare, for transportation, for energy. And what was great about that was I think it really made a lot of the policymakers that were focusing in those areas think about how they can incorporate broadband. I think that the FCC, as sort of the agency with the expertise regarding communications networks, could actually do more to encourage incorporation of broadband wireless into other sectors. And let me give you an example. I've been practicing now. I left the FCC back in 2001. I never imagined when I was there that I would be doing so much that was indirectly related to communications. I started doing work for auto companies about 2 or 3 years after leaving the commission, and that work has developed into sort of work on telematics and other aspects where the communications is moving into the vehicle. And you heard a lot, if you attended the keynote session this morning, you heard a lot about what GM is doing with infotainment. There's a lot that the FCC knows about communications networks, and if it worked more closely with some of its sister agencies like NHTSA, the transportation agencies, I think it could help those agencies sort of figure out how communications can help, for example, enhance traffic safety, road safety. Another example is mHealth. The FCC and FDA have done really great work recently sort of trying to grapple with the issues of how you regulate wireless medical devices. The FDA has a regime for how it regulates medical devices, and it's a very complex regime. If we're going to see the benefits that we all hope to see with respect to wireless medical devices, that regime is going to have to be streamlined in some way, and it's going to require that they take a different approach to the medical apps and the way medical apps that are delivered over wireless platforms are regulated. The FCC, as the expert agency, can help educate the FDA as to those issues. Another area is education. Right now there's an E-rate program that subsidizes broadband in educational institutions. There's very little money that's made available for wireless, for mobile, e-learning, for example. The FCC created a pilot project a few years ago, $10 million, where it gave $10 million out to a number of school districts to experiment with wireless e-textbooks. And the results have been great. So one of the things that they could do is they could reform the current E-rate program to make more money available to support that type of activity. Again, these are sectors of the economy, important sectors of the economy that we all know benefit from ubiquitous broadband. There are, certain, government actions, targeted government actions could actually help expand the benefits that are generated from, incorporating broadband in those areas.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move to the audience participation component. So if you have a question or a comment, raise your hand. I think we have microphones so people can hear your questions. If you have a question, we would ask you just to give us your name and your organization. So questions from the audience.
Not all at the same time, please.
Come on.
They don't want to go.
Okay, we have a gentleman right here with his hand up. There's a microphone coming up to you. Right there is a microphone.
Hi, just a question in terms of...
Give us your name and organization.
Hi, Brian Sobex, Mobility Architect, Kraft Foods. My question is this, in terms of notion of contextual relationship marketing, location-based services, the internet, mobile, how do you see, what are some of the great innovations that you see coming down the pipe, short-term and long-term, if you could take a whack at that?
Okay.
If I could guess what all the next great products would be, probably start the company myself. That's one of the great things about this platform is the barrier to entry is very low, and that's one of the great things about the internet. The barrier for entry is very low, and so anybody who has a great idea, they come up with it. And so I don't know what the next great thing is going to be, but all these companies are highly innovative, and it's important that the regulatory framework doesn't change to prevent whatever the next great idea is going to be. So just like 5 or 10 years ago, you couldn't have anticipated that everybody would be on their phone using social media, or how easy it would be to use maps, or how easy it would be to make a dinner reservation or find, what's around you. You can't anticipate that. And so maybe 5 years from now, we can't anticipate what the next innovation is going to be. And so I think the real message is for policymakers not to pass a law or create a new regulation in the agencies that can prevent, the next great app.
And I guess the way I would answer that question is, I don't know what the specific app will be, but I think it will be in the social area, because the old critique of digital technology has been that it's isolating, it's kind of a person using the technology by him or herself. But what we're seeing now is technology is emerging in collaborative forms. And so I think where the specific location-based applications will come will be in enabling social things, you know, restaurants, entertainment, clubs. When I look at young people and the types of ways that they like to use technology, they like to use it in a way that they're sharing information with their friends and sharing locations with their friends. So whatever the app is, I would think it most likely would be in the social area.
I would add another aspect of this is the contextual marketing and the other location-based apps are going to transform the market for wireless service from a more traditional provider and customer view, whereas the network provider sells a service to you, and that's the economic relationship, to a two-sided market, which is in economics getting much more scrutiny these days. So more like the classic example is a credit card network, where the credit card companies have both you, the consumer, as a customer, and the business who accepts it as a customer. And one of the things that comes out of studying, for example, the credit card market, is you as a customer becomes valuable. And that's why the credit card companies give you points and all these benefits for using the card, because they really want you as a customer, because you're worth something to them, and they're able to, in some sense, charge more to businesses for access to a network that has you on it, and therefore they subsidize the cost of you having the card. When the wireless network turns into a two-sided market like that, the economics of it are going to change radically. So now, as an individual customer, my information that allows this higher level of marketing and experience becomes valuable. It's certainly true that it's more valuable to me and that I get a better product out of it, but it may be the case that it's more valuable to the advertiser in a way that's going to end up benefiting me. And I don't know if they're going to pay for my wireless service for access, or if there is, I think, beginning of 2012, the carriers began, which I thought was a radical departure, began to allow app providers to pay for the airtime that their apps use. That's a real departure in the business model, where your time doesn't count against your bucket of minutes. So I don't know how it's going to play out, but it's going to be a very different economic relationship between the consumers and the networks, and what pays for this wireless infrastructure.
Okay. Other questions or other comments? Okay, in the very back, there's a question. And again, if you can give us your name and organization.
Sure. Tom Tozan with Tozan Consultants. With regard to big data and the marketing we're just discussing with access to all of our precious data, where does the industry see us going with regard to minors?
Minors?
Minors that are actively using mobile devices more and more.
Any comments from our panel?
I don't have an answer to it, but I would pose the question of whether you think the Facebook model is working or not. I just find it striking that it's an event in some families, I am told, when a child turns, is it 13, and can now get a Facebook account. It's like a coming of age event. In
my generation, it used to be getting the driver's license.
Yeah, right. If that works, I mean, that's a natural way for this to play out, in that there's just a kind of a bright line, and you're on one side or the other. On the other hand, I'm not hopeful that that's going to work, given behavior in other areas like food advertising to minors, where there's clearly issues. The industry's trying self-regulation, and it's not at all clear whether that's going to work itself out. So.
And I guess I would address that kind of from a congressional standpoint.
Yeah.
Because I think when you look at whether Congress is going to do anything specifically as it relates to minors, in a lot of respects, certainly people in the industry are pretty libertarian in not wanting the government to make regulations on any aspect of the digital world. And in general, members of Congress haven't really been very active in pursuing regulation. But historically, when you look at other areas, underage children is the one exception that legislators often make. They're, even if they're not willing to regulate a particular area, when it comes to young people, they are much more willing. So if there is any type of legislation that makes it through Congress in some of these areas, and particularly in terms of content, it's much more likely to be underage kids as opposed to the country as a whole.
Well, and there are a couple pieces of legislation that are already on the books as it relates to minors. The challenge that you have is the identity, so that the United States doesn't require, we do not have a national ID card. We don't have an electronic national ID card. So what is happening, though, is through the initiatives such as the National Initiative for Online Identity that the administration is moving out and building upon, these are some of the areas that everybody is hopeful will be successful so that you can deal with that issue of minors and distinguish between the services that are happening with minors versus adults. Because I think to your point and everybody else's point here is that this is one area where Congress will like to legislate, and if you want a light touch, this is an area where it probably wouldn't be a light touch. And so the privacy aspects of the things that I was bringing up in a general perspective, that is one area that is really looked at. The privacy, the online, what can be done, what can't be done, how are you doing certain things, and you guys who do the legal stuff, you see where that's all coming down. And everybody's really looking at the amount of information, big data, that I am willingly giving up right now in order to have a better online experience. So if I knowingly do it, that's one thing, okay? And so it's no violation of the Privacy Act, nothing along the lines like that. But if it is happening from a marketing perspective that I don't know as a consumer, that's where everybody's now starting to really look at and say, okay, the laws are a little ambiguous here, and we need to figure out what's the best way to do this and not to curtail innovation and economic development as we're going forward. So the minor issue probably will really force that discussion in this regulatory area.
Ari, is there anything you want to add to that?
I was going to agree with what was just stated. I mean, the problem is the informed consent model has been the model that industry has really been pushing in this area, but it sort of breaks down when you're talking about minors. So I agree, and in fact, if I remember correctly, I think in France right now there is an attempt to actually, I don't know if this is technically possible, to pass a law that will allow a person's online identity or history to disappear at age 18. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you know, so again, if industry isn't careful about it, how it handles minors, Congress probably will step in. Again, with minors, sort of the informed consent model kind of breaks down somewhat.
Good luck legislating an online identity disappearing.
I don't know if it's possible, but the French want to do it.
The North Carolina legislature once famously tried to make pi equal to 3, but I don't think it worked.
And France also just raised the top income tax rate to 7% as well.
Right.
So I'm not sure that's our model. But I'm curious.
But is losing George Depardieu a bug or a feature of that?
Right. Ari, since you raised the global issue, I'd like to generalize that question in terms of, we've been talking about the impact of mobile on economic development, and most of our conversation so far has been based on the United States. So I'm just curious if any of our panelists has a non-U.S. perspective in terms of how other countries are handling some of these issues. What are the innovations? Who's doing a good job? Are there bad examples that we should make sure we should avoid? Are there any non-U.S. things we should be thinking about here?
I'll start by just making a point. I spent, or had the misfortune of spending about 6 weeks in Geneva last year at the World Radio Conference. This conference that's held every 3 years where the world gets together and updates the rules for how to use the spectrum. One great thing about that conference was that this time around, the developing world was very aggressive about pushing for more spectrum for mobile. And the reason they were so aggressive is developing countries never had a very sophisticated fixed infrastructure. So for them, this is all new. They're building it from scratch, and they're doing it in a way, they've learned from the mistakes that we made and the mistakes the Europeans made and more developed countries. And we're starting to see, and when you talk to the regulators from these countries, they talk about things like, how important it is how important wireless is to their farmers, and fishermen, getting information about where the catch is, where they can catch the most fish and how they can get it to market more quickly and what the prices are, the prices that are being, Daryl, and the work that the Brookings has put out, talked a little bit about some of those issues, and it's amazing how, how developing country leaders, government officials have really understood, have learned the benefits in ways that we haven't, because we had a much more sophisticated infrastructure before wireless even came onto the scene. So, I'd say we've learned quite a bit about, there's probably more rural telehealth going on in Africa now or there's some more interesting and sophisticated telehealth programs going on in sub-Saharan Africa than they are in this country. And there are some places in this country, rural areas, that would benefit from learning more about what they've done in countries like Botswana, countries like South Africa, connecting doctors in urban areas to populations located outside, outside those urban areas.
I would add to that, my limited experience with U.S. trade negotiations is that we like to export our regulatory paradigms and our regulations, and we should be careful about that. A poster child for the economic benefits of mobile is the M-Pesa mobile money in Kenya. And it's not clear that would have developed so easily under a U.S. Regulatory paradigm, but the somewhat more open view, not having the same entrenched banking system that had to, and treating it all as if it was a financial institutions, I think certainly helped allow that to develop.
I would say in the work that I have been doing, a lot of it is related to data, cybersecurity, and privacy types of issues. So in the EU, when they're really looking at this, I would say that we're probably a little bit more laxed in our approach to some of these things dealing with privacy, security, and those types of issues, where the requirements that they want to have in order to adopt cloud and then do mobile and have their data out there are pretty stringent. And what we look at it from our perspective is, from a government perspective in the United States, is okay, that's higher risk data, that's a value-added service. We would request that in a contract, and we would negotiate it out and compete it out and say, this is how we want to manage the data, and it has to stay in CONUS, and you can't use certain data centers, and you can't do this type of stuff. Whereas they're looking at it as, okay, if you want the EU business, if a person gets off of Facebook and they say that they don't want to be on Facebook anymore, then their whole identity has to be gone, and you have to guarantee it's gone. It's a little bit, the model and the way that they're approaching the regulatory framework is a little bit different than the way that we would do it here through competitive process and through competitive procurements and allow for that economic growth.
And if I could just follow up on that, do you have a sense of what is the better way to go, particularly in terms of economic considerations, economic growth, job creation? Is our model a better way to go? Is their model a better way to go?
I'm for the free market, so it's a little bit, I think that if you want, for example, if the federal government, for example, is going to put in a higher level of security that they want to have for certain parts of their data structure, that is something that if they make that requirement known and they put it out, that industry would compete for it, and you would get the best services that you could for that, and that there would be competition for that. And you don't necessarily have to regulate it, but that the terms of the contract and the procurement would allow for that, to do that. The challenge comes, and this is both in the EU model as well as the United States model, is the enforcement for the lack of performing. So if if you don't do certain things that you agreed that you were going to do from an agreement, from a privacy perspective, from a data performance, from mobile availability of the applications, then how do you enforce it? And now we're full circle back to FCC or SEC or one of those type of regulatory models about what is the enforcement for non-performance of those activities.
Okay, we have just a little bit of time left. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Right here's a question. There's a microphone coming up behind you.
Hi, my name's Paula Please-Timmons, and I'm representing T-Mobile. I've spent most of my career working in the wireless industry and trying to wrestle spectrum away from the federal government. And right now, the federal government controls about 60% of spectrum holdings. My question is there any creative solution out there to try to incentivize the federal government to move off the spectrum? You hear a lot about sharing, and I just don't think sharing can be the only solution. It can be part of the solution, but it can't be the only solution. So I throw that out to you. Do you have any creative solutions?
Can I just make a point? I know Coleman's going to say something, but he has a lot to say about this. So an idea that's been suggested many times is this lease fees or spectrum fees. Ofcom, the UK regulator, has implemented spectrum fees. What they do is they impose fees on government users in the UK, government agencies that use spectrum. They say in your budgeting every year you've got to pay for this, just like everybody else. If that were done, I think that would lead some forward-thinking agency heads to look for cheaper ways to do it. And there would be less of an incentive to sort of hold on to the spectrum that they may not need. Now, in some cases, to be fair to government agencies, there are some government activities that they have to do themselves, that can't be handled via commercial providers. But there's a lot that's being done right now that could be done by commercial providers. So I think spectrum fees is something that we should look at, and I think it would require legislation, I think.
The nice thing about spectrum fees is that it puts an opportunity cost on this. It makes the government decision maker consider that they're using a valuable resource. The problem is that the government agencies are not free to trade the spectrum in a marketplace, so they're not able to actually benefit directly from the value-enhancing activities, but at least a well-intentioned manager would at least know they're using a valuable resource. The problem, and I've thought about this for a long time, actually my entire career. I started off at the Congressional Budget Office, and we were looking for lots of innovative ways. There is a fundamental constitutional problem that we face here, which is that Congress controls budget over executive branch agencies, and because of that separation of powers, it's important that Congress not relinquish that control. When that's true, an agency cannot reap the benefits of using their spectrum more efficiently. They can't sell it and keep the money because money's fungible and their budget allocation could be offset. And I have, in more than 15 years of thinking about it, have not found an actual solution to that problem. The best thing, I think, at the end of the day, is barter. That you could imagine, federal agencies have missions that they need to keep, that they need to perform, and that's obviously very important. They don't need to own the spectrum. We, under Truman, tried to nationalize the steel industry for the military, but we don't do that, even though steel is very important for our military.
Well, we almost did it with the banks in 2008.
We almost did it with the banks, that's true. Well, they almost gave themselves up. But with barter, you can imagine where you can have a relationship with an agency where a private company comes in and says, what's your mission? Here's how we can help you perform that mission better than you're doing it now. And if in doing that, it frees up spectrum, then we can have access to that spectrum. It can't be buying the spectrum, but it can be creating a partnership where the private company gets de facto rights over it and then gets to use it.
I'm going to give you some examples because I'm pretty familiar with what T-Mobile tried to do the last go-around. And so, and also, I'm a former CIO of Department of Energy, so the Power Market Administrations own a whole bunch of spectrum, so I was right in the middle of all of this spectrum issue the last go-around. And one of the things that I think would be good if you, when you talk about this, because we had to flip it around and talk directly to the agencies about why it's beneficial for them to do this, is in the case of the Power Market Administrations, they didn't realize, or what they had to negotiate, so it's a little bit more of the bartering type of thing, is that if you help them migrate to the other spectrum or migrate into the commercial spectrum, because that's part of the challenge. They don't necessarily have the expertise to do the migration or the money. And so part of what happened in the last selling of the spectrum was the migration costs were picked up by the vendors because they knew that they were going to grow so exponentially from it. So they helped migrate the federal agencies off of it, but also guaranteed a level of service. So they are worried that they are not going to be able to support their own customers through the migration. So there was a guaranteed level of service and then a period of performance that they could show that they could still perform at that new level, and then they were willing to give some of that up. Now, DoD is a different environment, and they'll never give up stuff. It's just DoD, right? But part of the other stuff that you're talking about, T-Mobile was involved in one of the law enforcement agencies. That wasn't really the bartering type of thing. They didn't have legal authority to do certain stuff. So this really comes down to your congressional authorizers. If they really understand, so this is the separation of power, if they really understand what you're attempting to do, then they can give the agency the authority that they need in order to be able to partner with you. And it wasn't that the federal agencies don't want to go with the commercial provider or do those types of things. It's that they get up to a certain point and they're not authorized to be able to do that. And the only way that's going to happen is if they get congressional authorization. So it has to work at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue in order for that to work. And nobody doesn't want to do it because they really do want to bring down their operating costs. And now is probably the best time to go into it because costs are huge on the agencies. So if they can bring down their operating costs, they're going to be all for it.
But I think your question highlighted the point that I think everybody has made, which is it's all about the incentives. Like, the only way to change the behavior is to change the incentives. Next week at Brookings, we're putting out a paper on building an innovation economy, and we have a variety of policy recommendations, some on spectrum, but some other areas as well. So any of you who'd like a copy of that, give me your business card and I'll make sure you get a copy. Any last questions before we wrap things up? Okay, you get the last question, which means it has to be a really good question, you know.
No pressure.
There's a microphone coming up right behind you.
Thanks. Tom D. Hoodie with Brandywine Global. This is a very, very complex topic. To what degree do government agencies, Congress, White House, have sufficient insight into the regulation that needs to be done, or the freeing up of regulation that needs to be done, or the freeing up of spectrum? I mean, there's also a lot of politics involved in this. To what degree do the bodies involved, the people involved, are they sufficiently informed to actually make reasonable judgments about this in a relatively timely way? I mean, spectrum is an issue which isn't that far away in terms of when we'll actually need more spectrum.
It's actually a great closing question for our panel. Do our national policymakers know what the hell they're doing on these technical subjects?
It's hard to answer that question in a few seconds. It's just, it's just very complicated. And unfortunately, the way telecom policy is set in this country, in the U.S., the various, you mentioned all of the components. The Commerce Department regulates federal users, and so they actually are more sensitive to the needs of the federal government users. They should also be sensitive to the impact of holding that spectrum, keeping it away from the commercial providers, what impact that has on the economy, but they tend to be more sensitive to the needs of federal users. The FCC does interact a lot more with the commercial providers, and they tend to be more informed about what they need. But it's a very complicated process, and there needs to be a lot more. The short answer is there needs to be a lot more coordination, a lot more exchange of information among all of the parties.
I think part of the challenge is that regulation and legislation doesn't move at the speed of the private sector and doesn't move at the speed of innovation. You know, take, for example, the 96 Telecommunications Act. I think it mentioned the internet in it twice. And so it's already kind of out of date. You know, companies then were siloed in very different ways than they are now. The private sector moves quickly. You know, companies are innovating in new ways. And, you know, by the time, you know, Congress gets around to something to the president's desk, it could be out of date, or, you know, could be out of date in 6 months, or even worse, it could prevent the next great innovation from ever coming about that's going to create economic development in this country and around the world. So that's one challenge. And the second is, and on the spectrum side, there are constraints. You know, on the spectrum, CBO gets the score and just decide what the value is, and so they aren't necessarily valuing the spectrum at really what the economic impact is going to be, and that ties the hands of Congress when they're writing a law to get government off of spectrum. If CBO gives it a score saying, oh, it's worth this amount, it doesn't matter what the real value is because they decide what the score is, and so Congress gets their hands tied in that.
And I know from other areas on this Congressional Budget Office thing and the scoring, that might seem like a very technical and inside Washington type of thing, but it really has huge consequences because CBO has always underestimated the technology benefits. And so when they're costing out, if we adopt certain policies, you know, what will be the net benefit, they always underestimate those costs, which then makes it very difficult for Congress to actually adopt that action. We've seen that in the healthcare area where, you know, there's health information technology and mobile health applications that are coming online. When you look at the scoring that CBO has done of those things, it's negligible and certainly way below what the actual benefits would be. Karen, we'll give you the last comment.
Yeah, I'd like to be a little bit more positive here about what happens in Washington, D.C. But and that's all true what you're talking about. But as a person who was in technology and had to manage this for 6 years against all of these different things and putting policy out, what it really comes down to is you have to know what you want to do at the end, or you want to know how you want it to change. So if mobile is where we want to go, which is obvious that we do, given the way that the question was asked here and how everybody's using their devices, then the policymakers and the technologists in DC then have to work together to say, okay, you don't write a regulation for a specific technology, you write it for a specific outcome that you want. And that's why things like the Privacy Act that goes back to 1980, the premise was right? You opt into it, and then you give up certain things. And so if you don't get wrapped up in the technology solutions, but you get into this is the outcome, so we want to be more mobile, and we want it to be flexible so that we can do X, Y, and Z while we're doing data, while we're protecting privacy rights, then you can do certain things. And Washington and the technology and the agencies and the regulatory folks, they do get that. It's when you start getting down into the weeds that's when it gets a little bit dicey. But if everybody's focused on the outcome, which is we're a mobile society and we're going to use this data and we have big data and we have these other things, then you step back from that perspective. And I don't think that, you know, Congress is against that. They just have to understand it, and then CBO will do what CBO does, because unless we can get them to change their rules, that's it. But the legislation and stuff like that will come, and the policymakers know it if everybody has the same outcome in mind.
Okay, that's actually a great.
30 seconds.
We'll give Coleman the last word.
Sorry. So just as a former CBO budget analyst who made CBO it's not them, it's the law is only about the federal budget impacts that they're supposed to score. That's the only thing that matters to the congressman. To answer your question, I don't think, it's only occasionally that the incentives of the policymakers line up with good incentives, with good policy. It happens, the spectrum reallocations are an example where it has happened, the ones that we've had, but overall there's nothing in the structure of how we make policy that would make one think that the incentives would line up right.
Okay, we will make that the last word, but I want to thank Michael, Coleman, Karen, and Ari, and thank you for sharing your views, and thank you very much for coming out as well. Thank you.